Let me start with a disclaimer. This is a rather unusual episode of the Mystery Machine, as we've had some technical problems with our broadcasting facilities, and have been reduced to using synthesized speech. Hopefully this won't detract from your enjoyment. Well, having got that out of the way, I'd better get you up to speed on what's been happening. As you know, Beverly Tutor is away in the States at the moment, trying to interview Deborah Harkness, who you may know as a best-selling author of our cult novel, Discovery of Witches. Look up on the internet. She's also a history professor, a very smart lady in whom we have an ongoing interest, not least due to her maternal heritage. In the meantime, on this side of the pond, I'm in Romsey, which is in Hampshire, looking into the possibly strange events surrounding the disappearance of Carl Fletcher Fraud. Because Beverly is not available to us for other projects, we have parachuted in another of our colleagues, Kate Singer. Kate, would you like to say hello?
Thank you, Andrew. Hello, everybody. I used to be a colleague of Beverly, back in the States, though before that, we had been both childhood friends, and were then sophomores at high school together. We both even became interns at the Oakland Tribune, before she went on to greater things at the LA Times. I won't say we stayed close, we lost touch after her promotion, but, over the years, we had certainly got to know each other well, and had a few classes together. We also had a few classes together, in the local tavern, on more than one occasion, but that's for another time. Anyway, enough of that. Time to get back to our story. Andrew, let me hand back to you now.
Thanks, Kate. Well, last time, if you recall, we were looking into a possible connection between Deborah Harkness, the author, and a tip from a listener who'd been on an ancestry website and claimed to have seen what looked like her family tree. The thing is that, according to our listener, Deborah Harkness is a direct descendant of Maggie Harkness, one-time leader of the mysterious New Forest Coven. The problem is, though it's easy to follow what looks like a positive lead on these sites, all too often, it turns out to be a blind alley. Maybe because sometimes it's a coincidence of names, or it's human error, or even just bad software design leading you astray. We tried to replicate the online route he says he took on the site, but we got nowhere. But, since Beverly was going back to New York to see family anyway, she'll dig around, talk to her contacts. But there may be nothing in it. More importantly, I am more concerned about what might have happened to Carl Fletcher Fraud. Fletcher Fraud was a 55-year-old newspaper editor. He returned home as usual one Thursday night in early August at about 9 p.m., and neighbors reported seeing the lights go on in his home, but when a work colleague, Tony Sutton, dropped by an hour or so later, although the lights were still on, and though he rung it several times, no one answered the bell. Now this may not sound very mysterious in itself, but Sutton decided to look through the letterbox, where he noticed Fletcher Fraud keys on the hall stand. Thinking that maybe the bell was out of order, he decided to knock on the door, and when he did, the Yale lock, which had not quite latched, caused the door to spring open until it was slightly ajar. He called out Fletcher Fraud's name, but there was no response, and when he put his head round the door, he immediately noticed a smell of burning coming from the kitchen. Now concerned, he went into the kitchen, where he found a milk pan that had boiled dry, burning away on the stove. He turned off the gas and dumped the saucepan under the tap. He then returned to the hallway, where he continued to call out Fletcher Fraud's name. Nothing. He took a quick look in the living room, where the lights and the TV were on, though the sound on the TV had been turned down. As he was about to leave the room, he thought he could hear a faint ringing sound. It seemed to be coming from the armchair, and when he looked down, he saw a glow from the side of the seat cushion. It was a mobile phone. When he picked it up, although he could see the caller's number, he couldn't answer it, or do anything else, because the phone needed a passcode, or a fingerprint or some such. He continued to call out Fletcher Fraud's name several times, but again, there was no reply. Sutton wasn't quite sure what to do next. After all, there could have been a simple mundane explanation. Fletcher Fraud could have popped out for some reason, maybe to one of the neighboring houses further up the road. Or perhaps, he had gone out to his car for something, and when he returned, seeing what looked like a closed door, he thought it must have slammed shut with his keys on the inside and that he was locked out. Or maybe he had collapsed somewhere in one of the rooms. He might even have been taking a bath. Anyway, having already made a cursory search of the house, before exploring it any further, Sutton decided to make a search of the garden and garage where Fletcher Fraud kept his car. The car was there, engine cold and with a flat front tire, but there was no sign of Fletcher Fraud. His search of the back garden had triggered the security lights, and so the garden was lit up like a stadium. Sutton looked in a greenhouse, a shed and even a small tool cabinet, but again, there was no sign of Fletcher Fraud. After he returned to the house, Sutton decided to do a more thorough search and look in every room. From the outside, he had already seen that it was a big house, with several floors, many rooms, and what looked like an attic. At the rear, a flight of stone steps appeared to lead down to the door of a cellar. He wondered why Fletcher Fraud needed such a big house. He searched all the floors, though some rooms were locked. But there was no sign of him. Returning downstairs, he also noticed that the back door was bolted from the inside, and that all the downstairs rear windows were barred. Not such an unusual thing, what with the rear of the house backing onto open fields, and in fact, there had been a few local burglaries in the immediate area over previous weeks, though, oddly, nothing ever seemed to have been taken. The locals had made a fuss, but the overstretched local police had remained unable, or unwilling to put much effort into either catching the perpetrators or in preventing further break-ins. Kids, the police had decided. A low priority. Of course, the locals didn't see it like that, and many of them had beefed up their security with fences, alarms and lights. To Sutton's eye though, Fletcher Fraud's security was clearly at the next level, and he had spotted CCTV cameras both at the front and the back of the property. Sutton was really concerned now, but still looking for a plausible explanation, and so, somewhat sheepishly, he knocked on a few doors and asked Fletcher Fraud neighbors if they'd noticed anything out of the ordinary, or even just seen him that evening. Although he drew a blank, no one had seen him. The neighbor immediately opposite Fletcher Fraud's house offered to let Sutton look through the recordings from his doorbell CCTV. Nothing. The coverage picked up Fletcher Fraud's arrival home, but there was no other movement recorded up to the time Sutton had rung his bell and then knocked on his door. Apart from a solitary passing dog walker. It was at this point that Sutton decided to call the police. Unfortunately, it being a Friday night and very busy, the police were unable to send anyone for several hours, and by the time they arrived it was fully dark and any chance of easily tracking down Fletcher Fraud were long gone. Not that they seemed too concerned. The police remained politely uninterested and clearly thought Fletcher Fraud had maybe had one too many and had maybe just wandered off over the fields in a merry state to enjoy the evening while it was still light, and was maybe sleeping it off in some random haystack. Either way, they weren't going to be doing anything that night. After the police left, the skies had cleared, revealing a full moon, which meant searching for Fletcher Fraud in the field and beyond his property would be a lot easier. Sutton phoned around, and managed to persuade a couple of initially reluctant colleagues from the Echo to help him, and between them they conducted a search of the fields immediately adjacent to Fletcher Fraud's house. The wood they didn't search. The trees were too dense, so it was too dark to see anything, despite the full moonlight. 3 years later, when they returned from their hunt, tired, hungry, scratched by brambles, they were no closer to finding Fletcher Fraud. Well, that's the background, and you might think just another missing person, but Fletcher Fraud wasn't just another person. He was editor of the Romsey Echo, the same local newspaper where Sutton also worked. And what I later found out put a very different complexion on his disappearance.